Let's go straight to the maestro, the doyen of psephologists, the man who's forgotten more about elections in Britain than most people will ever know. Professor Sir John Curtice, Professor of Politics at Strathclyde University in my old manor in Glasgow. Professor, thank you for joining us. It's not every day you get the chance to say that somebody's lost a seat they've held for 200 years, is it?
No, it certainly isn't. And the truth is, this is a by-election that the Conservatives should never have been at risk of losing. Yes, of course, governments find life difficult in by-elections. They often suffer quite a substantial swing. And, you know, a 20-point drop in the Conservative vote, you would have said, well, pretty bad, but, you know, not unprecedented. However, what we saw here was a 31-point drop in Conservative support. It's the second biggest drop in a by-election that the party was trying to defend in post-war British politics. And it occurred in a constituency that voted 60% for leave in the EU referendum. It's a very different constituency from Cheshire and Amersham, which Liberal Democrats also won from the Conservatives back in the summer. That was a pro-Remain constituency. It was one where the Conservative vote was already in decline, and where the Liberal Democrats had done rather well in the general election. That was, as it were, an apple ripe to be picked. In contrast, North Shropshire was stony ground for Liberal Democrats. They only managed to come second narrowly once in the course of the last 6 elections. You might well have expected that the Labour Party would have had a go at it, but they decided to leave it to the Liberal Democrats. And the Liberal Democrats took that opportunity, frankly, with quite amazing success.
Now, how do you account for it? It can't be Brexit because the constituency was overwhelmingly Brexit. So what was it?
Well, the most immediate and proximate explanation is undoubtedly the Prime Minister's difficulties of the last 6 weeks. The national opinion polls have told us that in the wake of the Owen Paterson affair, of course, an affair that led directly to this by-election, but secondly, the video that was released of the mock press conference in which reference was made in a somewhat nervous, giggling fashion to an alleged party/gathering on the 18th of December last year in contravention of the lockdown restrictions and various other stories since about that, in the wake of which it's quite clear the public do not believe, 2/3 of them, that the Prime Minister's been telling the truth. His personal ratings have fallen quite substantially, and support for the Conservatives has literally fallen by 6 points in 6 weeks. That's quite a substantial and speedy drop by the normal rhythm of opinion polls. So it was already clear that there was quite a substantial body of disaffection including many people who voted Conservative in 2019. And in the context of a by-election, when there was a party pitching for the protest vote, then the government was potentially vulnerable. And in a sense, I think one of the important things, therefore, about this by-election is I think this is the first by-election at which we can say that the Liberal Democrats regained the role of the classic party of by-election protest at times of Conservative difficulty. That was a role they performed readily and often before 2010, when, of course, they entered into coalition with the Conservatives in government. Since then, the only by-elections they've won have either been constituencies that voted Remain, like Richmond out just in London, or Cheshire and Amersham just outside, or in Brecon there was a bit of a deal with Plaid Cymru. Now we see the Liberal Democrats doing well in a pro-Brexit constituency, but just picking up the protest vote. A protest vote that in part comes from people who would otherwise have voted Conservative. That's the foundation of it. But then also managing to persuade people who would otherwise vote Labour to vote for them. And I think this also begins to mark the end of the antipathy amongst many Labour voters to the Liberal Democrats because of their involvement in the coalition, an antipathy that has meant that Labour voters have perhaps been less willing to switch to the Liberal Democrats tactically, than they were in the past. Perhaps now that era has been forgotten so far as Labour voters are concerned. So that's all the most immediate proximate stuff. Now, we should remember, however, that support for the Conservatives has indeed been falling even before the Owen Paterson affair. And to that extent, at least, this is also part of a longer story whereby the fact that the Conservatives have had to increase taxes, or at least they're going to have to increase taxes in order to fund the health service and social care, that's some Conservative voters are not too happy about. Of course, there were the problems with shortages of lorry drivers, shortages in the supermarkets, etc. That also has helped to erode the Conservatives' perceptions for competence. So put all this together, and a government which had seemed relatively self-assured against a pretty weak opposition, all of a sudden has lost that assuredness of foot, and indeed has just simply the combination of circumstance and self-inflicted damage now sees it, as much as 12, 13 points adrift of the tally it had just 2 years ago.
And how much of all of that could be positively affected by a change of leader?
Well, let's break it down into the two parts. There's the circumstances and there are the self-inflicted wounds. The self-inflicted wounds are undoubtedly largely Boris Johnson's responsibility. It was Boris Johnson who tried to get his troops to overturn the proposed suspension for Owen Paterson, only eventually having to climb down because of the adverse reaction. And it's Boris Johnson who has been trying to say to people the rules were not broken a year ago, there wasn't a party, statements that he frankly has not been able to persuade large sections of the public to believe. Now, both these incidents are perhaps indicative of a wider criticism or characteristic of the Prime Minister. This is a Prime Minister who is focused on trying to get what he wants done, and is relatively unconcerned about the process by which he gets there. This, after all, is a Prime Minister that back in September 2019 was told by the Supreme Court that he had broken the law in trying to prorogate Parliament and therefore stop it from meeting as part of his attempt to try and drive Brexit through. Now, on that occasion, he didn't suffer a serious adverse public reaction because at least half the public were in favour of his objective, which was trying to pursue Brexit. The reason why the Prime Minister's style has now been his undoing is that he's still tried to pursue that style for two things that nobody else believes in. One, there isn't a public out there who thinks that it's a good idea that MPs' lives should be made easier and that they should be allowed to take money in order to lobby ministers. Nobody thinks that's a good idea, so therefore people object to the attempt to try and avoid Owen Paterson's suspension. And there certainly isn't a constituency out there of voters who think, well, yes, of course, we have to keep to the rules on lockdown, but it's absolutely fine if people in and around 10 Downing Street don't. We know that from the Dominic Cummings affair, that people think very badly of those close to the Prime Minister seemingly ignoring the strict lockdown rules. So at this point, the Prime Minister's style becomes his undoing. Now, whether or not Boris Johnson can change his style, well, who knows? It will require a change, but changing the leader would certainly perhaps mean we had somebody who was less likely to make that kind of mistake. But that still doesn't leave the other problems the Conservatives face. They are faced the fact that they're still having to manage a pandemic, a very difficult pandemic. Of course, it's resurged, and the government faces some very difficult choices. And of course, we are talking about a Prime Minister and a party that is frankly deeply reluctant to go back to much in the way of restrictions. We saw the difficulty that was last week just simply introducing some relatively modest measures. 100 Tory MPs reject. The London stance is very different from that in Edinburgh and Cardiff and Belfast. all of which have tighter measures and all of which, frankly, wish to impose tougher measures, but are limited at the moment by the fact that the UK government wouldn't be willing to fund these tougher measures. Now, the pandemic isn't going to go away. Making those difficulties and dealing with it is something that this government is going to have to deal with, irrespective of who's prime minister, and it may have to make decisions that is not in accordance with its instinct. The other thing, of course, is that the pandemic has resulted in this government planning for levels of public expenditure and taxation which are in both cases, either the highest in 50 years or in one case pretty much the highest since the 1950s. This is not a comfortable position for many Conservatives to be in. But again, whatever were Boris Johnson's instincts, and it's not entirely clear that Boris Johnson is a small state politician, but the truth is just trying to deal with the legacy of the pandemic has, in a sense, again, forced the Conservatives into a position which many of them find uncomfortable. And whoever were to succeed Boris Johnson will still have to deal with exactly those same realities that Conservatives struggle to deal with.
Now, you mentioned the C word, Cummings. To what extent have things begun to rattle down for Boris Johnson since he parted company with his Svengali? Maybe the Prime Minister's brain is missing.
Well, first of all, remember that it was Dominic Cummings' famous trip to Durham and then to Barnard Castle that first did serious electoral damage to the Conservatives. Before that trip, they were running at about 50% in the polls because everybody was hoping that they were going to solve the pandemic. That balloon got punctured in the wake of Dominic Cummings and they never recovered from that. But actually, remember that not long after Dominic Cummings left Downing Street, the Conservatives' position, which at that stage was around 50-50 with Labour in the polls, improved quite considerably because, of course, of the vaccine rollout. There is no doubt that the vaccine rollout is the one element of the pandemic that the Conservatives have persuaded people is A, a success, and B, a success for which they are entitled to take the credit. And of course, they also argue that they were able to achieve this because we weren't inside the European Union. Now, that's a position we can argue about, but that's the claim they make, and it's a claim that they've sold very successfully. So actually, during the spring, summer of this year, Conservatives quite clear lead in the opinion polls. No Dominic Cummings around. It's only more recently that the ship of state in 10 Downing Street has proved to be rather more difficult. Now, it's certainly true, and frankly, I don't know these characters in 10 Downing Street any better than anybody else. One is told that the people who are now in 10 Downing Street are perhaps both amongst officials and amongst special advisors are perhaps somewhat short on the kind of experience that might be needed to deal with the Prime Minister's office in a time of crisis and difficulty. Well, I'll leave that to rest. I simply report what we are told, but clearly it's certainly not been a happy ship at 10 Downing Street, and it's certainly not one that has dealt with recent affairs with acute political intelligence.
Now, as Macmillan taught us, it's never one damn thing, but one damn thing after another. And no sooner was North Shropshire and its message delivered across the face of the Prime Minister, one of his key cabinet ministers, Lord Frost, walked out the door. How much is that going to damage him?
Well, I think the Lord Frost story kind of takes us back to the fact that, Boris Johnson's initial problem during the last 6 weeks was not so much with the electorate, although the electorate, as already said, have had their negatives about him, but actually losing a lot of the trust of his parliamentary party. The Owen Paterson affair, in which he marched his troops into the lobby, only then to do a U-turn 24 hours later, did an awful lot of damage to many Tory MPs' confidence and trust in the Prime Minister's ability to do the job effectively. And since then, we're almost perhaps beginning to see that old fissure inside the Conservative Party that Boris had managed to end, that fissure between the libertarian, Brexit-inclined end of the party and the more centrist, end of the party that's decided to swallow Brexit but was never keen on it, that fissure may be opening up again, because of course many of those who have been sceptical about the lockdown measures, really from during the course of the last 12 months, have come disproportionately from those who made Theresa May's life pretty much a misery over Brexit. And Lord Frost is undoubtedly somebody who's part of that number. He's clearly somebody who is very keen on Brexit. The fact that we have a Brexit which minimises the extent to which the UK is obliged to follow EU regulations is entirely the product of Lord Frost's vision. He is also a small state conservative. He's amongst those Brexiteers who was hoping that Brexit was going to lead to smaller government, less regulation, and he's also instinctively against lockdown. And certainly that this incident is together with the vote last Tuesday, is perhaps an indication as to how Boris Johnson is now at risk of seeing his premiership beginning to be run ragged by internal divisions within the Conservative Party. And indeed, not on Tuesday, the only way he could get his vote through was off the back of Labour votes. Now, it's his good fortune at the moment. The Labour Party are willing to back him over coronavirus in the way the Labour Party weren't willing to back Theresa May over Brexit, so therefore the rebellions meant she couldn't get her Brexit deal through. But of course, one of the fascinating things again that we're now looking at is what's the Labour Party going to say about coronavirus in the coming days and weeks. At the moment, they're still standing back from actually saying, we think the government should introduce more measures, but maybe they will. And then the question is, well, if Boris Johnson doesn't follow them, does he then lose the confidence of the Labour Party in the handling of the pandemic? Because at the moment, that's not something that the Prime Minister can afford. But of course, equally, he finds himself caught in a rock between a hard place. He can't afford to upset his own party much anymore.
And then a Tory MP for Bridgend drives his car into a lamppost and fails the breathalyzer. Breaking news. Another by-election, perhaps, Sir John. We'll have to wait and see.
We'll have to wait and see. It depends, of course, whether it becomes a custodial offence or not, or whether, I mean, there's got to be a reason as to why the by-election is triggered, and that would normally require him, there being some kind of custodial offence. So we will have to see whether that's the case. Of course, in the meantime, the other thing which is true is that Liz Truss has been put in charge of the negotiations that Lord Frost has vacated, so evidently nobody knew he was going to be added to cabinet. So that means that Liz Truss is now not only Foreign Secretary and Equalities Minister, but has now got to try and extract the government from the weeds of the Northern Irish Protocol, a protocol, of course, to which the Prime Minister agreed in the first place, but which so far at least the UK government has not been able to negotiate the deal in a way that either with which it's happy, or indeed many people in Northern Ireland are happy.
Well, she's been set up to fail on that, isn't she? I mean, Boris doesn't like that she's been on manoeuvres, literally on top of a tank, imitating Mrs. Thatcher. And now she's got to go and defend a position which I think in their heart the Tories have already sold.
Well, you may be right. That could well be the Machiavellian position that the Prime Minister is going. On the other hand, of course, she is a bit of a convert to Brexit. I mean, she was very keen on negotiating free trade deals when she was Secretary of State for the Department of Trade. And indeed, I think it's her performance in that role that helped persuade the Prime Minister that she should replace Dominic Raab as Foreign Secretary, a role in which Dominic Raab didn't always seem to be entirely happy. So, you may be right, George. The alternative interpretation is that perhaps he's decided that he needs a safe pair of hands, but a pair of hands that perhaps might be somewhat more willing to do his bidding than perhaps in the end Lord Frost was willing to do. Lord Frost, at the end of the day, very clearly had his own agenda over Brexit, an agenda that perhaps the Prime Minister was happy to allow him to pursue for a long time, but not when it began to cut across other decisions that the Prime Minister felt was essential for his government.
Professor Sir John Curtice, as always, a pleasure.